Welcome to Chapter 7 on Skeletal System. This will actually consist of two PowerPoint presentations. The first is an introduction to the skeletal system and will cover the skull and axial skeleton. An important thing to keep in mind is that bones are an organ. Each bone is its own separate organ because by definition, organs consist of several types of tissues that function together. Each bone consists of the bony matrix, cartilage, dense connective tissue, blood, and nervous tissue. Let's look at some of the functions of bone. Bone provides a site for muscle attachment. It also provides protection, supports soft tissues. The ends of the long bones are the area where blood cell production occurs. Bones also act as a reservoir of inorganic salts. Bones can be classified according to their shape. Flat bones, like the name implies, includes the ribs, scapula, and skull bones. Some bones are irregularly shaped, and irregular bones often articulate or attach to other regular bones. Examples of irregular bones include the vertebrae and facial bones. Your arms and legs are classified as long bones. Your wrist and ankle bones are classified as short bones. Some bones are found embedded in a tendon, and these are referred to as sesamoid bones, which means like sesame seed shaped. The largest sesamoid bone in the body is the patella or kneecap. On this slide, you can also see a sesamoid bone that's found in the thumb. Let's look at the parts of a long bone. Long bones have expanded ends, which are called the epiphysis. Hyaline cartilage, or articular cartilage, covers the end of epiphysis. This provides protection so that the bone doesn't rub up against adjacent bones. The long part or shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. Bones have a vascular connective tissue covering called the periosteum. The periosteum is continuous with ligaments that tie bones together and tendons which attach muscles onto bones. The center of the shaft of the bone has a hollow space called the medullary cavity. This is lined with the endosteum. This contains yellow bone marrow, which is storage area for triglycerides. The epiphyseal plate is the growth plate. This is an area which allows for bones to increase in length. It separates the diaphysis and the epiphysis. There are two types of bone tissue. There's compact bone, which forms the wall of the diaphysis, and there's spongy bone, which forms the epiphysis. Spongy bone, like the name implies, looks like a sponge, and it has these mineralized struts, which are called trabeculae. Spongy bone helps to reduce the weight of the skeleton, and this type of material can withstand stress from many directions. Here you can see the spongy bone, and it does look like a sponge. There's a very thin layer of compact bone that covers the entire outside. Here you can see the trabeculae up close. Let's look at the microscopic structure of bone. Bone contains living, mature bone cells called osteocytes, and they live in little spaces called lacunae. They are found in concentric circles around the central canal. The central canal contains blood vessels and nerves. In between these circles of lacunae containing osteocytes, there are bony plates of calcified matrix. This is called the lamella. The lacunae are connected together by canaliculi, or little canals. This allows the passageway of nutrients and gases. Let's look at the extracellular matrix of bone. It consists of organic and inorganic components. The organic component is collagen, and collagen helps provide strength and resilience. The inorganic salts provide hardness and resistance to crushing. This is a slide of compact bone under high magnification. In order to be able to view bone under a light microscope, it has to be dried and then ground. So in the central canal area, it appears very dark. You're not going to see any living blood vessels or nerves. The same thing in the lacunae. There aren't going to be any living osteocytes found there. So any of these open spaces where these living structures were found is going to collect this dark bone dust. So looking at compact bone, there are living osteocytes found in lacunae, surrounded by rings of extracellular matrix. This material is formed into individual modularized units called osteons. The opening in the middle is the central canal, and that contains blood vessels and nerves. The central canals are interconnected together by perforating or Volkmann canals. Spongy bone does not contain osteons. The matrix consists of the trabeculae. The osteocytes reside in between these bony struts. Let's briefly look at bone growth and development. Bone replaces connective tissues in the developing fetus, and this can occur by one of two processes. In inframembranous ossification, this is found in the developing bones of the skull and clavicle, the flat bones in the human body. The finished bone consists of spongy bone with compact bone on both sides. Endochondral ossification is a little bit more complex because when these bones are completed, they have a diaphysis, they have epiphysis, they have hyaline cartilage remaining connecting the epiphysis and diaphysis that functions as the growth plate. There's also a hollowed space in the center, which is the medullary cavity. So again, these start off as cartilage, which kind of forms a model, then it's broken down, mineralized, and these additional structures are formed. Let's look at the homeostasis of bone tissue. About 3 to 5% of your bone calcium is exchanged each year. So these osteons are constantly being broken down and rebuilt. Mature bone cells are called osteocytes. Osteoclasts are cells that tear down bone matrix by secreting enzymes. Osteoblasts build bone matrix. This remodeling process is regulated by hormones that regulate blood calcium levels. Calcium is also needed for muscle contraction and nerve cell stimulation. And so if your blood calcium levels drop too low, calcium will be removed from your bones to where it's needed. So bones kind of act as a reservoir of calcium. Physical exercise also affects bone tissue. Muscles pulling on bones stresses the bones, and this increases the bone's thickness and strength. Ideally, the osteoclast activity equals out the osteoblast activity, and your bones are remodeled and remain very strong. However, in osteoporosis, osteoclast activity is greater than that of osteoblasts, and your bones can become porous and weakened. Nutrition is key to bone development, growth, and repair. Vitamin D is necessary for calcium absorption in the small intestine. Growth hormone stimulates division of cartilage cells of the epiphyseal plate. After puberty, sex hormones stimulate ossification of epiphyseal plate to end the growth in height. Now we're going to look at the axial skeleton, and many of these bones and structures you'll also be covering in lab. The skull consists of the cranial and facial bones, hyoid bone, vertebral column, thoracic column, including the ribs and sternum, are all part of the axial skeleton. Just think axial, straight down the center. The appendicular skeleton is the arms and legs, or upper and lower limbs, and the bones that anchor the limbs, the axial skeleton. This includes the pectoral girdle, your upper limbs, your pelvic girdle, and your lower limbs. This is going to be covered in a separate PowerPoint presentation. Here's a list showing all the bones found in an adult skeleton. There are 206. The skull is made up of 22 bones, 8 cranial bones, 14 facial bones, and then the malleus, the incus, and the stapes are the 3 bones that are found in each middle ear. The cranium encloses and protects the brain. It provides attachment site for muscles. The cranial bones contain paranasal sinuses. There's a maxillary, ethmoid, sphenoid, and frontal sinus. The sphenoid and frontal sinus are more readily seen in images of the skull. Sinuses are mucous membrane-lined spaces. They help to filter and moisturize air. They lighten the weight of your skull, and when you speak, your voice resonates in your sinuses. That's why your voice can sound different if you're congested or have a cold. There are 13 immovable bones and a movable lower jawbone that make up the facial bones. The facial bones form the basic shape of the face. They also provide attachment sites for muscles that move the jaw and control your facial expressions. So there's PowerPoints that are also included as part of the lab, but you might want to look at your lab packet as we're going through these specific bones. There are 6 bones that form the bony orbit of the eye. Now, some books will also include the palatine bone, but that has a very minor role, so we kind of go with the phlesms. Phlesms meaning frontal, lacrimal, ethmoid, zygomatic, maxilla, and sphenoid. So this is the orbit of the eye, the area where your eye resides. Let's start the frontal bone. The surfaces of bones are not smooth. There's roughened areas, there's depressions, there's grooves, there's openings, there's passageways, and this allows for blood vessels and nerves to move through the bone. There are sites for muscle attachment, and so whenever we're talking about a bone, we'll also be discussing bone parts. Bone parts are individual areas on the bone. Right, so the frontal bone, the bone parts include the supraorbital foramen. Foramen means opening. So this is a small opening that's found above the orbit of the eye. So supra means above, orbital foramen. The frontal bone also contains the frontal sinuses. Sometimes the supraorbital foramen looks more like just like a little knot. It may not appear to be a perfectly round circle. The lacrimal bone is a small bone that forms the medial wall of the orbit of the eye. It has an opening that's called the nasolacrimal duct. Your lacrimal glands produce tears that cleanse the sclera, the white of your eye, and these tears then drain through this nasolacrimal duct into your sinus cavity. So if you ever notice if someone's crying very hard, that their nose starts to run. So you can see these are kind of small bones. They're a little bit deep to the anterior aspect of the skull, and it's maybe a little difficult to see here. A little easier on the right hand view. You can see there's a little opening there where it houses the nasolacrimal duct. The ethmoid bone is shaped like an iceberg. It's located from the sphenoid bone. Its features include the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, which forms part of your nasal septum. It also contains 2 pairs of scroll-shaped bones, the superior and middle nasal concha. Or think of it means like a conch shell. So it's kind of a curved bone. And when you breathe in, air swirls around these curved bones, and it kind of has an effect of when you put clothes in your dryer. It causes the air to swirl around, that any dust and debris get trapped on this mucous membrane, It also helps to warm and humidify air. The cribriform plate is a rectangular area that has a bunch of openings in it. These are passageways for your olfactory receptors, the receptors for smell. The crista galli looks like a little triangle that sticks up in the middle of the cribriform plate, and this provides an attachment site for your meninges, the membrane that covers your brain and spinal cord. The ethmoid bone also has ethmoid sinuses. This, however, is not visible on any of the views that you'll be covering in lab. The view to the right shows the ethmoid bone. The structure that's extending downward where your nose would be is a perpendicular plate of ethmoid. That and the vomer bone found beneath it form the bony structures of your nasal septum. In the middle, you can see the projection that's sticking upward. That's the crista galli. This is also visible in the image to the right. The crista galli is surrounded by the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate is studded with small holes that allow for the passage of your olfactory receptors. The zygomatic bones form your cheekbones and the lateral walls of the orbit of the eye. Key feature includes the temporal process of zygomatic. Now this terminology is used several times. Where it says of zygomatic, that lets you know that this is part of the zygomatic bone. Temporal process means this is the part of the zygomatic bone that articulates and joins with the temporal bone. So the temporal process of zygomatic joins the zygomatic process of temporal. This is just a reverse. This is a projection of the temporal bone that extends the zygomatic bone, and together they form the zygomatic arch. The maxilla is your upper jaw, and this houses your upper teeth. It also forms the hard palate of the roof of your mouth and the floor of the orbit of the eye. Its features include the infraorbital foramen, which are similar to what we saw in the frontal bone with the supraorbital foramen. Another part is the palatine process of maxilla. Your hard palate consists of the maxilla and the palatine bones. And so the portion of the maxilla that extends to the palatine bone is called the palatine process of maxilla. So together, both these bones form the hard palate. The maxilla also contains the maxillary sinus. The view on the model right shows you the infraorbital foramen. When you want to say more than one foramen, the term that's used is foramina. The sphenoid bone is a bat-shaped bone that forms the base of the cranium and the sides of the skull. Key bone parts include the optic foramen or canal. This is where the optic nerve enters into the skull. The sella turcica, which is where the pituitary gland resides, and the sphenoid sinus. So if you look at the upper left image, it does appear to look like a bat, right? So you can see on the bottom left how it forms the lateral part of the skull. The center is also showing you an inferior view. If you look at the lower right, again, you can see how it forms a bat-shaped part. And the region that's in the center is the sella turcica, where the pituitary gland resides. The mandible is your lower jaw, and this supports your lower teeth. This forms the only movable joint of the skull, the temporomandibular joint. So there is a projection called the mandibular condyle that articulates with the temporal bone. The mental foramen or openings that are found on either side of your chin, and where your chin comes to a point, the very bottom, is called the mental protuberance. The palatine bone is an L-shaped bone that's located behind the maxilla. This forms the posterior portion of the hard palate. So you can see where the palatine starts off as two individual bones that fuse in utero, connect to the two individual parts of the palatine process of maxilla that also fuses in utero. So you kind of have an intersection of all these individual bone parts, and if they fail to fuse, that's what's known as a cleft palate. The nasal bone forms the bridge of the nose, and this does not participate in the formation of the orbit of the eye. So if you notice, the maxilla extends all the way up into the frontal bone. The nasal bone is more anterior. The vomer bone makes up a portion of the nasal septum. It connects with the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. Right, so this is the bone that's found at the bottom. If you look at the view on the bottom right, that gives you a mid-sagittal section view of the vomer bone, and above it you can also see the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. That view also gives you a good view of the frontal sinuses, which are located superior to the sphenoid sinus. The sphenoid sinus resides right below the sella turcica. While the superior and middle nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone, the inferior nasal concha are their own two separate bones. So in this view, you see the inferior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, the superior nasal concha are located too far up into the sinus cavity to be visible. The parietal bones form the sides of the skull. Sutures are movable joints that connect skull bones together. The word suture means seam. So the sagittal suture is the articulation between the two parietal bones. The coronal suture is where the parietal bone articulates with the frontal bone. So, right, if you parted your hair down the middle, that would give you an idea of the location of the sagittal suture. And here you see the parietal bone and the frontal bone, and where that articulates together is the coronal suture. The temporal bone finds the lower sides of the skull and the base of the cranium. And features include the zygomatic process of temporal. Remember, that articulates with the temporal process of zygomatic, forming the zygomatic arch. The mandibular fossa. This is where the mandibular condyles of the mandible articulate to form the temporomandibular joint. The styloid process are very thin projections, which are attachment sites for muscles and ligaments of the neck. The mastoid process is an area found right behind your ear, which is attachment site for the sternocleidomastoid mastoid muscle. The opening that allows sound waves to enter into your ear is called the external acoustic meatus. And the squamous suture is what articulates the temporal and parietal bones. So squamous meaning squished, like we talked about types of epithelial tissue. So it's kind of an irregularly shaped suture. So you can see it's highlighted in the upper middle image here. This slide also shows you the mastoid process, which you can feel is like a bump behind your ear. And you can see the external auditory meatus. Meatus is a term that means opening. TMJ, temporomandibular joint. This is your jaw, movable lower jaw, and it's the only movable joint found in the skull. It is formed by articulation of the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone with the mandibular condyle of the mandible. The occipital bone forms the back of the skull and the base of the cranium. Its features include the foramen magnum. This is a large opening that allows for the passageway for the spinal cord. The occipital condyles are rounded projections that articulate with your first vertebrae. The very back of your head comes to somewhat of a point or ridge, and this is the external occipital protuberance. The occipital bone articulates with the temporal bone via the lambdoid sutures. So this shows you several different views. There's a lateral view of the skull, the occipital bone. You can view it inferiorly, and also when looking at the cranial floor. Right. The foramen magnum is the opening where the spinal cord exits the skull. Let's review the sutures of the skull. The coronal suture is where the frontal bone articulates with the two parietal bones. The sagittal suture is the articulation of the two parietal bones. The squamous suture is where the temporal bone articulates with the parietal bone. And the lambdoid suture is where the occipital bone articulates with the two parietal bones. If you notice the view in the middle, there's kind of three irregularly shaped structures. These are known as sutural or Wormian bones. Some individuals have additional cranial bones. So let's review the bones of the skull. Forehead is your frontal bone. Right, the sides of your skull, located superiorly, is your parietal bone. Back of the head is the occipital bone. Coronal suture articulates the frontal and parietal bones. Sagittal suture articulates the two parietal bones. Lambdoid articulates the occipital bone with the parietal bones. The fontanelles are the soft spots found on infant skull. These are areas of incomplete inframembranous ossification. This allows for the movement of bone during childbirth and allows for the skull to easily expand during brain growth. There are four fontanelles. There's the largest anterior fontanelle, posterior fontanelle, anterolateral, so it's toward the front and side, and posterolateral fontanelle. The hyoid is a U-shaped bone that helps support the tongue. This is the only bone in the body that does not articulate directly with another bone. This is a bone that's often broken during victims of strangulation or hanging. Let's look at the vertebral column. The vertebral column consists of bony vertebrae that are separated by fibrocartilage discs. The vertebral column supports the head and trunk and protects the spinal cord. Each vertebrae consists of a variety of different parts. The main part of the vertebrae is called the body. There's an opening in the middle that allows for the passage of the spinal cord, and this is called the vertebral or spinal foramen. There's projections that stick out to the side. These are known as the transverse processes. The spinous process extends posteriorly. The vertebrae stack and attach to each other. So each vertebrae has a superior articular process on the top and an inferior articular process on the bottom. So as they stack together, the top of one vertebrae would attach to the bottom of the vertebrae above it. The intervertebral discs are found between the bodies of the individual vertebrae. It's very important that the spinal cord is protected, and it's surrounded on all sides by bony structures. You have the body of the vertebrae protecting the spinal cord, and then there's two small extensions that go up the sides, what are called the pedicle, and the lamina forms kind of the roof. Yeah, definitely need a visual to understand this. So you see the spinous process, which would project posteriorly, transverse to the side. You can see the spinal or vertebral foramen. That's where the spinal cord is. It's protected by the vertebral body. These little projections on either side, which are the pedicles, and kind of the arch across the top is the lamina. During embryonic development, if the lamina fail to fuse, this causes the birth defect spina bifida. This view is showing you the superior and inferior articular process. The vertebral column is not straight, but consists of a series of curves. There are three types of vertebrae found in the human body: cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, and the cervical vertebrae support the head. And there are some features that allow you to distinguish between what's a cervical vertebrae versus thoracic or lumbar. Unique feature of cervical vertebrae is they have a very distinctive transverse foramina, or I say kind of an extra set of holes on the transverse process. Another unique feature is that it's bifid spinous process. That just means the spinous process often is split or looks like a snake's tongue. There are 2 of the cervical vertebrae that have unique names. The first, C1, is also known as atlas. This is the vertebrae that articulates with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. This supports your head. This vertebrae is very round in shape, does not have any body or spinous process. It does contain the transverse foramina. This forms a joint with the occipital bone that allows you to nod your head yes. C2 vertebrae is called the axis. It has a tooth-like extension that's called the dens or odontoid process, and this forms a pivot joint with the atlas that allows you to shake your head no. This cervical vertebrae also has transverse foramina. This picture is showing a typical cervical vertebrae. You can see the bifid spinous process and the extra holes located in the transverse process, which are known as a transverse foramina. So whenever you see the extra set of holes, you automatically know that this is a cervical vertebrae. This shows atlas. See, it looks like a little ring, and it has these long depressions that articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. And here you can see axis looks like a little tooth, this dens or odontoid process. Next, look at the thoracic vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae. These articulate with the 12 pairs of ribs. The difference between the thoracic and the cervical vertebrae is that thoracic vertebrae, they are larger and stronger than the cervical vertebrae. They don't have the transverse foramina. Their unique feature is that the spinous process is very long and points downward. This is sometimes difficult to see, but there's also little depressions or facets on the side of the body of the vertebrae that show where the ribs attach. Notice the absence of transverse foramina. The lumbar vertebrae are the largest of the vertebrae. It consists of 5 massive vertebrae. And the body of the vertebrae is much larger because it supports the weight of the body. These are located in the small of the back. A key feature here is that the spinous process extends out straight, is very thick, short, and blunt. These images will be more apparent when you do your lab modules. This view also gives you an idea of how the sacrum articulates with the ilium, one of the bones of the coxal bones. The sacrum is a triangularly shaped bone located at the base of the vertebral column. It actually consists of 5 poorly developed fused vertebrae. Key features include the sacral promontory and sacral foramina. The sacral promontory is kind of the upper rim, which is the most anterior part of the sacrum and is used as an obstetrical landmark. There are holes that pass down the sides of the sacrum, and these are the sacral foramina. The coccyx, also known as the tailbone, is the lowest part of the vertebral column. It consists of 3 to 5 fused vertebrae. The average number is 4. Right, so here you can see the promontories like the top rim, and the little openings on the sides are the sacral foramina. You don't have to worry about whether they're posterior or anterior. We're just going to identify them as sacral foramina, and you can see the coccyx that's attached. Here you can see how the sacrum articulates with the vertebrae and to ilium, or hip bones. This slide shows the coccyx attached to the sacrum. The thoracic cage includes the ribs, thoracic vertebrae, sternum, and costal cartilage. The costal cartilage is a cartilage that attaches the ribs to the sternum. The thoracic cage supports the pectoral girdle and upper limbs. The thoracic cage also protects the internal organs of the thoracic and upper abdominal cavities. The thoracic cage also plays a role in breathing. There are 12 pairs of ribs that attach to the thoracic vertebrae, and they can be kind of categorized by their structure. The true ribs, pairs 1 through 7, they join to the sternum directly by their costal cartilage. Pairs 8 through 12 are known as the false ribs. They do not reach the sternum directly. Pairs 8, 9, and 10 piggyback off the cartilage of the 7th rib. Pairs 11 and 12 are also known as floating ribs because they do not articulate at all with the sternum. There are several unique features of ribs. The main part of the rib is the curved shaft. The end is the head. The head articulates with the thoracic vertebrae facet. The tubercle is a little bump, and that articulates with the transverse process of the thoracic vertebra. This shows you the whole rib cage. You can see ribs 1 through 7, which are the true ribs, and then ribs 8 through 12, which are the false ribs, including 11 and 12, which are also known as floating ribs. What's shown in white is the costal cartilage. This slide's indicating the true ribs. Here we have the false ribs and the 2 pairs of floating ribs. This just gives you an idea of the way that the rib articulates with the vertebrae. So you can see the head is on the body of the vertebrae where the rib facet is located, and the tubercle is articulating with the transverse process. The sternum is commonly known as the breastbone, and some unique features include the top portion known as the manubrium, the main part of the sternum is known as the body, and the tip is referred to as the xiphoid process. The top part is the manubrium, main part of the rib is the body, and the very tip is the xiphoid process. That concludes the axial skeleton. Be sure to view the presentation on the appendicular skeleton. The end.